Hey everybody, this is Trisha Sheehan. I am a holistic health coach with Wellness Warriors, and I'm the founder of the event Healthy and Ready for Anything, which you can find in Facebook groups. Today's discussion is the next one in a series called Science Unsettled. You can find the others on my YouTube channel, which is Trisha Sheehan, TRICIASHEEHAN. And I'm really excited about today's guest. It's Dr. Wiggy Saunders, who I've known for several years now, and just operates a large practice in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and always has really, practical, relevant, helpful, and inspiring information and tips to share. So, Dr. Wiggy, I'm going to let you go ahead and take a moment to introduce yourself so everybody can get to know you a little bit.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so Dr. Wiggy Saunders, I have been practicing integrative medicine for the past 9 years now. I have a practice in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We have been open for 10 years, and I've been there for 9. And we really focus on, addressing the underlying problem, and that's really the big perspective for integrative medicine. So we do try to get people off of medications, try to fix the underlying root cause, and a lot of times people do really well. Besides a physician, I'm also a husband and dad of 4 crazy boys. We also have a couple other side businesses. So we have a supplement line, Health as It Ought to Be. My wife and I, Emily, we also have a kids toxic free product line. And so, pretty busy, but hands in lots of different pots right now.
Yeah, which makes it very relevant to sharing information with people today, because you're really staying on top of a lot of information. And I know that's hard for a lot of doctors to do who are practicing. And, I heard a quote that said that science and new studies can take about 20 years to filter down into practicing medicine. So do you find that to be true? And how do you stay on top of the latest?
Oh, absolutely. So I think that is one of the challenges with medicine, is that it does seem like it's a very slow process to apply some of the new information, some of the new research that comes out, because there's a bit of a hierarchy. It seems like with traditional medicine. So whatever kind of the top says, that's just is the standard, and that standard, once it becomes established, it's really hard to break out of that standard, even though new information and new research is being figured out and being found all the time. And so I do think that it's a bit of a old school method to kind of do that, just go based on a lot of ways just tradition, and you really aren't able to adapt as quickly as we need to, because again, science and medicine, it changes so quickly. I mean, this is not something that you can wait for years before you change things. Things are changing really every day. And that's one of the things I really love about integrative medicine, but not even just integrative medicine, but also having my own practice, is that we do not have to rely on kind of the top-down approach. We can say, okay, look, this is what we've figured out. We found some new research. This is applying to this circumstance that we're dealing with today. Let's go ahead and make this part of the practice. And that, I think that's really what medicine really needs to be, is we need to be more adaptable and flexible as new information comes out.
Absolutely. And I think I heard you mention another podcast about, do we really need to wait sometimes for a double-blind, placebo-controlled study to help patients? And when you've seen a lot of different people dealing with COVID-19, and when you're seeing what works and what doesn't work, are you just going to go ahead and do what you're seeing is working, or do you need to wait years for the studies to come out?
Right. And that's kind of what I was saying, is that waiting sometimes takes too long. And so you can't necessarily wait for everybody to agree that this is the right approach to take. So instead, with integrative medicine and how we practice, is we definitely, we look for those large randomized controlled trials. We're looking for that evidence. I do think that's a high level of evidence, but that's not the only level of evidence. There's also, there's anecdotal cases, there is, biologic plausibility. There's also kind of general consensus. And as a kind of integrative provider, we have a kind of a general consensus about a lot of things, and that is also changed pretty quickly. But the community tends to kind of share the information with each other. So when one provider says, "Hey, you know what? I'm having some really good results doing this," and then some other providers start doing it, and then we have 10 providers all practicing the same way, and they're getting consistent results. that is a good amount of evidence when you have, that number of providers, that number of patients, and you're getting consistent results with each one. And so that's where, it is more of a flexible, collaborative approach for this versus a very isolated, living on an island. We have to control all these different variables. This is, I think that, again, you're going to miss a lot of different things if you are only looking for that type of evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And why do you think that that's being shut down on a more national, sort of official level? There's no collaboration.
Mm,
There's lots of censorship. There's doctors getting in some trouble for talking about certain topics.
yeah. Gosh, I wish I knew what the motivation was behind that, because in a lot of ways it is frustrating to see the censorship for sure, and how things are getting shut down so easily, and kind of a knee-jerk reaction. I think there could be multiple things that are related to that. With whenever you're outside the box, you tend to kind of be seen as outside the box. And so if with the standard care, the standard approach, if you fall anywhere outside of that, then it's almost as if you're automatically assumed to be wrong,
Right.
versus assuming that you're right, and let's develop more information to support that. And so, I think it really just goes back to kind of this a bit of an old school mentality, is that it has to be done a certain way, and that if you fall outside of that box, then you're wrong, and we have to try and show everyone that you're wrong. And so a lot of times we do see, physicians that are being made an example of, and say, well, we're going to shut them down because they're doing something that we don't fully support at this time. And so I don't know. And I think one of the also more frustrating things is that, especially with, talking about in relation with coronavirus, is that a lot of the things that were being recommended by physicians early on were basically, they were lambasted to say, this is a terrible thing, you're going to hurt everybody. But now, after the fact, now that we're kind of seeing this downward trend, now things are starting to be like, well, actually, that was probably a pretty good idea. Maybe we should be doing that again. And so it is frustrating. I think there obviously has to be some political element to it. I think there's a bit of a pride element as well. And unfortunately, medicine is really an area that has a lot of pride. Doctors tend to have a lot of pride about what I'm doing is right. And if you're not doing it the same way I am, then you're wrong. So I would say that I'd say actually pride may be one of the bigger problems in medicine.
Yeah, that's very interesting and good for people to know, because a lot of people are living in fear right now,
Mhm.
and they're having trouble making sense of it. And to have some of that background understanding of, why is this dynamic happening between different types of doctors, and why the disagreements, and just to have some context, I think for people is really helpful. And I know in your office, your big tenet that you have with patients is empowering them. So it's not just, you come to the doctor, you do what I say, which is kind of a little bit more of a conventional approach or an old school approach.
Sure.
Can you speak more about, how can people empower themselves in this very confusing and overwhelming time to figure out what the heck should they do? Because, sort of the experts don't have it all figured out. This is all new. And so what tips
Yeah.
might you have for them?
Gosh. So I would say that the best way to empower yourself as a patient is to actually ask questions. I know it seems like a kind of a simple way to look at this, but it's to really say, to think critically, and to say, okay, this is what's being presented, but is this actually true? And look at kind of all sides of the equation. And if you can look at all the different sides of the equation, a lot of times I mean, I think patients are able to figure a lot of things out if they have the information. Because, I think that sometimes we tend to think that, it's only the experts that can figure things out, but I tend to think that patients can figure things out. And I have a lot of patients that are more educated on certain subjects than I am, because that's really all that they focus on, and they read everything, and they look at everything and do all the research. And so they have a very good understanding for the physiology and the chemistry behind certain conditions. But I think from an empowerment standpoint, it's really about a change of mindset from I would say almost like a blind faith in the experts
Yeah.
to more of a critical perspective to say, okay, this is what they're saying, but what is someone else saying? And then trying to, again, continue to tease through that to say, okay, I'm hearing some conflicting things. What seems to make the most sense? That's oftentimes the the right answer. What makes the most sense? And then you can kind of start putting together what you feel like is the most truthful approach to this, because that's where people, I think, run into problems, is if they're empowering themselves, but they're empowering themselves with a unilateral perspective.
Right.
They say I'm only getting information from this source because they have to be right. I think that actually confuses people more, because then if they're only hearing from this, then they're getting some conflicting information, and then they start to question everything.
Right.
Versus if you start off questioning things, I think you have a more likely to get to the truth if you start by thinking critically and then navigating your way to where you land.
Yeah. And one thing I've noticed about your office as well is that it's not so much as a one size fits all approach. This is the protocol for this. This is the protocol for this. You might start with a protocol, but you can tweak it based on individuals. It's their genetics, it's their lifestyle, it's their diet, it's their blood type. I mean, there's so many different factors. And it seems like your office is really moving towards personalized medicine, where it's working for the individual versus just doing one exact thing for everyone. Is that the direction you're going in? And can you speak more to the future of medicine in that perspective?
For sure. And this ties in a little bit to what we were talking about earlier about different levels of evidence and waiting around for randomized controlled trials. And I can't remember who said this, but there was someone that said, standardized research works well for standardized patients.
Right.
But a lot of times people are not standardized. We try to control for those different variables in this research, but everybody is so unique. Everybody has different genetics, different physiology, different environmental exposures, different family history. I mean, there's so many different variables you cannot control for all of those things. And so I think it's actually a bit of a disservice for patients to lump them all together and say, well, this is what the standard patient should happen to them, then this is going to work well for you too, versus looking at it from a holistic or an individual approach and say, okay, let's look at all these different factors, like genetics, like medical history, like family history, environmental things, all those things. If you look at that starting from an individual perspective, then it also, I think, allows you to be more flexible with your treatment for each person. So if something doesn't work, then okay, well, that didn't work. Well, let's try something else. And so I think that, all medicine should be individualized. And I think, conventional physicians, they'll try to do that. Again, I think everyone does see each person as an individual. But when you're stuck within certain parameters and certain framework as far as what type of medicine you can actually do, it limits your ability to treat patients as an individual.
Yeah, for sure. And, patients need to advocate for themselves and find someone like you to partner with and someone who will listen. And that's what a lot of people say about the providers in your practice is they're just such good listeners. And sometimes there's a bunch of healing that just happens in being heard. But, being able to speak up for oneself and say, you know what, I didn't feel right on that, whether it's, an herbal or a prescription, and just being able to say, nobody is in your body, and, doctors don't have x-ray vision into every little thing. So just, empowering patients to advocate for themselves, speak up, and to be mindful of, what's going on with you, like what feels right and what doesn't feel right when you're doing it, and having that partnership to figure it out is pretty key, but very unique. I think that what you do in your office is really different.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's so crucial when between the doctor and patient is to have that level of relationship. And that's one thing I always tell my patients is that, if we're not getting necessarily the response that we'd expect to get, I say, that's not necessarily what I expected, but I trust with what you're saying. I trust that you are telling me that this is what's happening with your body, and so I'm going to go off of what you're telling me. And I think that's a big thing for medicine, is that physicians do need to, in a lot of ways, listen more and talk less. We have to be hearing what our patients are saying, how the treatments are working, and we adjust to that, and not just say, well, this is what should work. And even saying, this is what your blood work says you should be feeling, then we're not going to make any changes. We go patient first, then we do, blood work and everything else second. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, and not only that, but just trusting what the patients are saying. That I think most patients really are in tune with how they feel, and they have a good idea of what is happening inside their body and how they're feeling. And so making adjustments based on that, I think is kind of the key.
Yeah, totally. I also wanted to get your perspective on something that you're probably seeing a lot of, maybe with patients, but certainly on social media, is this sort of movement around trust the science and follow the science, and this idea that science is settled and it's black and white, and that is the only way that we can understand what's going on in our world right now. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, and I'd like to talk a little bit on this, because I think this is a pretty deep subject, and I have seen a pretty strong shift from a true definition of what science is to, again, kind of like a blind faith that it will have all of the answers. And I was thinking about that question, earlier, because I think that science at its core is basically the discovery and exploration of the natural world and trying to search for truth. It's a seeking mentality. It's not a settled mentality. It's not saying, okay, this is the truth, we just need to make sure everyone knows it. It is a seeking and a striving for the truth, versus this kind of new mentality which says, trust the science. It's almost becoming almost like a religion.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, where people are saying this has to be truth, or this is truth, and my truth must be the absolute truth. And so and that's where, when you start treating things like a religion, then you start becoming so emotional around what is being presented and what you consider to be the truth. And it's also where you can be really shaken to your core when we find out new information that this wasn't the truth. Right. And so, science is not meant to tell us what is the truth. It's to strive for discovering that. Right. And that is an ongoing process that continues to change and evolve, and we learn new things, and we do get closer and closer to the truth. But it's not a kind of this mentality, this mindset that this will answer all of our problems, and that we have faith in science, and that we have hope in science. That, I think, is actually misplaced faith and misplaced hope. And a lot of times, again, this leaves people confused, and I think it also leaves them without true hope, because things do change.
Yeah. So do you see skepticism or trying to be open, like you're talking about? Do you feel that that's being anti-science?
No, see, actually, I think that is a true definition of what science is. Yeah. Is that we should be saying, is this actually true or not? And asking those questions, I believe, is actually what pushes science forward. Because if everybody and all the experts agree on everything, then what's the point of science?
Right.
We don't even need it anymore if we have all the answers at this point. So no, I think that's where we're actually confused, and we're not asking those questions, and we're trying to silence skepticism and asking questions. And I think that actually is stifling science. We're not able to make as much progress as we could be if we were more open to discussion and open to debate.
Yeah. And I know that on the Healthy Discourse podcast, you talked a little bit about masks and vaccines, and of course, a lot of this trust the science mindset is in relation to those things. And you made an interesting point that it might have a lot to do with fear and the need to control something. Can you speak a little bit more about that mindset and that perspective that this might be what the dynamic that's going on behind masks and vaccines?
Sure. Well, this is kind of like we were saying about science is almost becoming a religion. And so if you have faith in science, the opposite of faith is actually fear. It's not disbelief, it's actually fear. And so there's no question that there's a lot of fear, around the coronavirus and around other, medical conditions that does drive a lot of people. But what fear does, it pushes you towards looking for something to put your faith in. And so because really what fear is an element of feeling like you're out of control.
Yeah.
Like you cannot control the environment, you cannot control what happens to you, you cannot control what happens to your family. And so you have to be looking for something that you can put your faith in that gives you a feeling of control. And so that's where I think people are putting their faith in science to say, this is what I can trust in. This is what can help control the situation. And so it gives them a little bit of peace of mind to think that there is something that they can hope on. And I think we're seeing this shift from a faith in God to a faith in science. And you can have both. I mean, it's not that you automatically are irreligious if you believe in science. I love science. I think science is going to give us a lot of answers for things. But I also don't think we should put our faith in that. And so, one thing that I think is kind of interesting is that there was all these signs out that says, "Thank you, Jesus," with a specific design, and said this is where people are putting their faith in. And now there are the clones of that say, "Thank you, science," which
Right.
is really getting interesting to see that they're really shifting that from a supernatural faith to a faith in the study of natural and materialism. That's really what science is. And again, that's where I think that's misplaced. You can believe in science, you can strive to push it forward. But like I said, I think putting faith in science, I think that's misplaced faith.
Yeah, and there's so much that science can't explain,
Mm-hmm.
and is outside the parameters of current science, because science is done by humans, and humans are imperfect and
Yeah.
not all knowing. And so I think that's an interesting point for people to consider, whatever that looks like for them, that there's sort of some higher power or
Yeah.
something else going on that's beyond our understanding from a scientific perspective right now. And perhaps just going within again and thinking about your faith and the bigger picture,
Mm-hmm.
and spending a little more time away from the media
Yeah.
and with oneself and your values and your beliefs. Maybe
Yeah.
that can be the way to find some peace and calm and solace through this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one thing that you said is that, science cannot give us the answers for everything, because certain things cannot be studied in the natural world. That's just impossible. But another important thing to point out is when we think about science as being settled or having all of the answers, is that we also have to understand that science can be biased.
Right.
And so, really, for anything that you're trying to come up with an answer for, people can manipulate the data and the science to end up in that result. And that's an important thing for people to understand, is that, okay, yes, so there was a study that showed, this works. But who did the study? Who funded the study?
Right.
Where is all the raw data to actually look at all the numbers before they actually published it? Because that's one thing that, and this is looking kind of more at the pharmaceutical industry, but that's one thing that I've always been hesitant to really push pharmaceuticals and medications, because there's so much bias in those studies. Those studies are terribly biased. And so if there's a study that comes out that says the medication doesn't work, they will just not publish it.
Right.
They'll just bury it and say, okay, well, we're not going to present that to the public. And if there is a study that suggests that maybe it works, then they can manipulate the numbers and massage it, basically, to end up showing that it does work. And so that's also where I think people need to understand is that one study or even a handful of studies, if there is potential bias behind it, it's not settled. That should be like what, and that's again going back to the whole skepticism. Who's doing the study? Who's funding it? Who will gain from this if this goes forward? And it's because those things also play a role in what determines what is truth. Is there bias behind it? And so to say science is settled is in a lot of ways that's anti-science.
Right.
It really is, because you're saying, okay, this is final. We know the answer. And you lose that element of critical thinking and the element that science depends on. And so, like I said, you basically are saying, thank you, science, but I don't believe in science anymore.
Right.
Which is kind of confusing, but that's the way I see it now.
Yeah. And I think once people take a moment to really think about it, I think some of the points you're making will become more obvious. It's just, when you're in a place of fear and overwhelm, it's hard to really muddle through this, which is why I wanted to have this discussion series about science and is it settled or not, and to help people get a little more perspective and context, because like you said, there's so much faith being put in it, but it's perhaps misplaced faith. And, perhaps hearing from you, it's a less sensationalized approach. You're being very, logical and unemotional. And I think this just gives people a lot of perspective to really try to understand, the information that's coming into their world, and a different way to think about it, and a different way to partner with a medical provider to individualize your approach and what you should do. I think that's a big deal. Is there anything else, any dynamics that you see going on in your office? And you see a lot of people, you see a lot on social media. Is there any other, tips or takeaways you have for folks? Do you think will try to help them through the pandemic?
Well, I wouldn't say there's necessarily tips or anything that I'd say are very helpful, but I would say that it's been very encouraging actually talking to a lot of my patients about what's happening, and that there are a lot of people that are questioning things, and there are a lot of people that are thinking outside the box, and they're starting to question things and say, okay, there's got to be a different way of doing things. So I'd say that's actually more of an encouragement. And the other thing I think I'm starting to see is that with this new mindset with kind of scientism, is that it actually feels like the box of science and medicine is becoming smaller and smaller. Like what you're saying, this has to be, you have to fall within this framework. It feels like it keeps shrinking. And again, because it is a mindset of saying, okay, science is settled. We don't need to investigate this anymore. So we can make the box a little smaller. And every time we feel like we've come up with the answer, we can make it a little bit smaller. But what that is doing, I actually feel like that's putting a lot of pressure on the people that have been within the box. So a lot of patients, but I'd also even say doctors are starting to feel more squeezed by this mindset. They're starting to feel like, gosh, this doesn't feel comfortable to say that everything is established and that everything is already final right now. So I think in a lot of ways, this is a good thing that this is being presented, because sooner or later, there's going to be too much pressure and people are going to be spilling over out of the box, and they're going to be starting to explore alternative medicine. They're going to be exploring integrative medicine. Doctors are going to be starting to ask questions and say, maybe there is a different therapy for this. Maybe there's something else I can be doing. And that a lot of times will be like their first step. So just like the coronavirus, there are, really good first line therapies that are available that are being presented and being, encouraged by the integrative community, but traditional community is saying, no, can't do it. We're not going to mess with that. But more and more doctors, because they do care about their patients, I think most doctors really care about their patients. And so they want to do what they feel like they can in order to help them. And so when they're being squeezed so much, and there is other options that are available, they're dipping their toe in the water and saying, well, okay, maybe this is something here. And then they try it, and then it works.
Yeah.
And then they say, well, okay, that's interesting. If that works, what else am I missing? And so then they take another step out of the box. And before you know it, then now they're practicing integrative medicine. And so I think in a lot of ways, this is going to be a catalyst for people to be seeking integrative care, to be more proactive, to be more partnership with their physician. And I hope that we're also going to see more physicians that are going to be stepping out and saying, you know what, maybe I should explore a different way of doing things. And so I'm actually very encouraged and hopeful, even though it feels like things are getting a lot more restrictive and things are getting a lot more censored. In a lot of ways, that actually pushes people to consider things when things start getting so tight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm very encouraged by, everything that you do and share, and all your articles and videos that you do to help educate the rest of us, and just really appreciate your thought leadership on these issues in the pandemic, and all of the effort you put into your patients and the general public. So thanks for all you do, and thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye, everybody.